A palace the color of deep water rises from the borderlands at the edge of the known world. Stone towers that don't point they reach. Gardens that survived a war. And somewhere inside those walls in the cold, dim corridors running on failing backup power, a man nobody invited is opening a panel that nobody was supposed to open. He's not a soldier, not a diplomat, just a technician with a battered toolkit and a field notebook and 30 years of knowing what broken things look like from the inside. He sees something. He writes it down. He says nothing. Down the hall, a 7-year-old girl sits alone with her father's books. A father 18 months gone, teaching herself symbols no one taught her in a palace that has forgotten how to be warm. Then one Thursday morning, small feet on stone, a question neither of them was ready for. And somewhere above them, both a queen who has not let herself feel anything in a very long time watches, and waits, and begins very quietly to change her mind. Part 1. The man who came to fix the lights. The train didn't have a name. Most trains didn't out here. Past the outer coalition transit hubs, past the checkpoints with their tired guards and their tired paperwork, the trains just ran. No fanfare, no announcements, just the sound of old machinery doing what it was told. Corvin Ashtay sat by the window and watched the landscape change. He'd been watching it for 6 hours, the familiar gray-brown of coalition industrial zones giving way to something older, something that didn't have a word in standard yet. The Valkyrie borderlands looked like someone had taken a world that was almost beautiful and then decided at the last moment not to finish it. He understood that feeling. His toolkit sat in the overhead rack. Battered case. Latches he'd replaced 3 times. The kind of bag that said, "I go where the work is not where the money is." Which was true, usually because those were different places. You're Ashtay, the young technician across from him. Ren Galoy, 26 maybe, still had that look, the one where you thought the work was going to be interesting. "Yeah," Corvin said. "You've done Valkyrie contracts before, once." Ren waited. Corvin didn't add anything. "I heard this one's complicated," Ren said. "Palace infrastructure. Post-conflict grid damage. The briefing said the Eastern Wing's been running on backup power for 7 months." "Right, 7 months. That's a long time." "It is." Another pause. Ren was learning. "Why'd you take this one?" the young technician asked. "I mean, no offense, but it's far. The pay's coalition standard. There's easier contracts closer to home." Corvin looked at the window, at the landscape that was almost beautiful and then wasn't. "Because nobody else wanted it," he said. Which was true. That was the only true part. The other part, the part he didn't say, was that home had been very quiet for 2 years. The kind of quiet that gets into your walls, into the spaces between furniture, into the particular silence of a kitchen in the morning when there's only 1 cup on the counter and you still reach for 2. That kind of quiet. He'd taken the Valkyrie contract because it was 6 months and far away. Because 6 months far away was better than 6 months inside that kitchen. Because the work had always been the thing that made the quiet manageable. And the work here was complicated enough to require his full attention, and his full attention was exactly what he needed to give something right now. Something that wasn't the kitchen, something that wasn't the cup. He watched the borderlands pass, almost beautiful, then not. He understood. The Valkyrie Royal Palace was not what the briefing materials had prepared him for. The briefing materials had said historic structure, partially damaged infrastructure systems, compromised during recent territorial engagement, coalition repair team assigned, full diplomatic protocols apply. What the briefing materials had not said was that the palace looked like it had been built by someone who genuinely believed that a building should make you feel small. Not in a cruel way, in the way that cathedrals made you feel small, in the way that old forests did. The kind of small that reminded you the world had been here longer than you and would be here after, and that was not a threat, but a fact, and facts could be lived with. Stone the color of deep water, towers that didn't point so much as reach, gardens that had survived the conflict better than the East Wing had, because apparently whoever had done the targeting had more respect for Valkyrie horticulture than Valkyrie electrical infrastructure. Corvin stood at the service entrance with his toolkit and his paperwork and waited. and waited. A Valkyrie official eventually appeared. Young, formal. The kind of formal that was doing a lot of heavy lifting, covering nervousness mostly. Or disdain. Sometimes those look the same. Engineer Ashtay. Yes. Your credentials have been processed. Your access is restricted to technical zones as outlined in the coalition agreement. You will not enter residential wings without escort. You will not engage with palace household staff beyond operational necessity. You will not. I'm here to fix the lights, Corvin said. The official stopped, blinked. Yes, he said after a moment. Among other systems. Right, among other systems. Corvin picked up his toolkit. Where do I start? He started in the East Wing, which was where the briefing said the damage was worst. 7 months on backup power meant 7 months of strain on systems that weren't designed for it. He'd seen this before, not in palaces, but in the principle of it. You pushed something past what it was designed to do, and it didn't break all at once. It just slowly became less itself. The components held on, did their best. But doing your best under conditions you weren't built for had a cost, and eventually the cost came due. He moved through the corridors with his diagnostic equipment. Quiet, methodical. The palace staff gave him wide berths and careful eyes. He gave them nothing to look at, just a man with a toolkit, just another contractor. The invisible kind, which was the kind he'd always preferred being. Invisible meant people left you alone to do the work. The East Wing electrical conduits were in the walls here, older architecture maintenance access panels every 20 meters. He opened the first one, stopped, crouched down with his handheld diagnostic scanner and looked closer. And looked closer. The damage pattern was wrong. Coalition ordnance, the kind used in the territorial engagement 6 months before the conflict ended, created characteristic surge patterns when it hit power infrastructure. He'd seen those patterns on 3 previous contracts. He knew what they looked like. Scattered. Explosive. The electrical equivalent of a shout. This wasn't that. This was deliberate. Quiet. Precise. The kind of damage that said, I know exactly how this system works, and I know exactly which components, if compromised, will create cascading failures that look accidental for months. Not the work of a bomb, the work of a person. Someone who had stood in this corridor with the access panel open and made specific choices about what to touch and what to leave alone. Corvin sat back on his heels, looked at the panel, looked at his diagnostic readout, took out his personal field notebook, the small one, not the official project log, and wrote down what he was seeing. Numbers, patterns, the specific sequence of which components had been compromised, and in what order because the order mattered. The order told you something about how the person had thought about the system, whether they'd started at the source and worked outward, or started at the edges and worked inward, whether they'd been in a hurry or taken their time. This person had taken their time. Then he closed the panel, stood up, and went back to work. Not because he didn't care, because he'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do with information you didn't yet understand was act on it before you did. Half-understood information had ended more good intentions than outright ignorance ever had. You observed, you recorded, you built the picture until the picture was complete. Then you decided what to do with it. His wife had always said he approached everything like a diagnostic problem. She'd meant it as a gentle complaint that he was too methodical, too patient, too willing to wait for the full picture when sometimes you just had to act. He'd taken it as a compliment. She'd laughed because she'd known he would. He shook the memory off, went back to work. The palace staff continued giving him wide berths. The East Wing continued being wrong in ways that only he could see yet. The backup lights continued running dim and yellow through corridors that were waiting to be properly lit. Patient work. The kind of work that looked like nothing until it was everything. He was good at that kind. The girl appeared on a Thursday, which he knew because he logged everything by day. And Thursday was the day he'd moved to the Eastern Technical Junction, a larger access space where 3 major conduit lines converged. More room to work, more complexity to understand. The kind of problem that required you to hold multiple things in your head at once and see how they related. He'd been there for 2 hours, alone as usual. The palace staff had worked out a comfortable rhythm of ignoring him which suited everyone. Then a sound. Small feet on stone. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the connection he was making because interrupting a connection mid-process was how you got problems that looked like something else entirely, and then he looked up. A child. 7 years old, maybe? Valkyrie features the slight luminescence at the temples that Valkyrie children had before it faded in adulthood. The pale gold hair that caught light differently than human hair did almost like it was generating its own. She was wearing something that was probably supposed to be court dress, but had been significantly modified by what appeared to be active use. A smudge on the hem, one ribbon coming loose from where it had been tied. The overall impression of someone who had started the morning correctly dressed and then lived in the clothes since. She was looking at his diagnostic equipment with the expression of someone who had just found something they'd been looking for without knowing they were looking. And she was carrying a notebook. Small, leather-bound, worn at the corners in the particular way that meant it had been handled often and carefully by someone who loved it. Not worn from neglect, worn from use, from being taken out and opened and held and carried everywhere. "What are you fixing?" she asked. Direct, no preamble, no checking whether she was supposed to be here. Just the question offered with complete confidence that it was a reasonable thing to ask and that a reasonable answer would be provided. "Power conduits," Corbin said. "The junction where three main lines meet. When any of them have problems, they all have problems." She considered this. "Like a knot," she said, "where all the threads go through the same point." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "like a knot." She came closer. Not hesitantly, there was nothing hesitant about her, but with the considered approach of someone who understood that equipment should be respected, even if people sometimes didn't need to be. "Can I see?" He thought about the diplomatic briefing, the list of restrictions, the official who'd said you will not engage with palace household staff beyond operational necessity. He thought about the 17 pages of coalition access protocols he'd read on the train and the specific clause about unsupervised contact with palace residents. He looked at the girl. "Sure," he said. She crouched beside him, perfectly comfortable on the stone floor, the way children were comfortable on floors everywhere, regardless of species or social standing, and looked at the open panel with the focused attention of someone whose interest was genuine. "What do those symbols mean?" She pointed at his diagnostic readout. "Power flow. Each symbol represents how much energy is moving through that section of the conduit. When the reading is in the green range, the conduit is functioning correctly. Yellow means I need to watch it closely. Red means there is a problem that needs addressing. And that one's red. That one's red. Why?" He explained, not in the way you explain things to children when you were trying to get them to go away simplified to the point of uselessness. With a lot of "that's a good question and you should ask your parents." But actually, the real reason, the way the conduit casing had been compromised at a specific stress point, the way that created resistance in the current flow, the way resistance became heat, the way heat became component degradation, the way degradation became failure. The whole chain in language she could follow if she was paying attention. She was paying attention. She listened. Completely. Without fidgeting. With the stillness of someone for whom this was not courtesy, but genuine engagement. When he finished, she looked at the panel for another moment and then opened her notebook. He caught a glimpse of the pages and stopped. Stopped in a way that must have been visible because she looked up at him with those direct eyes and said, "What, those symbols," he said, "in your notebook." She looked at her own pages. "I copied them from Papa's books. He had a lot of books about the palace systems. I've been working through them." Papa's books. He looked at the symbols more carefully. They were technical notation. Specifically, they were the technical notation of the Valkyrie Pre-Coalition Electrical Engineering System. The one that had been developed before the Coalition standardized everything. The one that had been used to design this palace's original infrastructure before the Coalition systems had been overlaid on top. The one that Corvin had taught himself from archived documents before this contract because he knew he'd need to understand the original design to properly diagnose what had gone wrong with it. The system that the late King Edrin Voss, who had, according to the historical records Corvin had read, during his contract preparation, trained as an engineer before political circumstances had redirected his life toward the throne, had personally used to design the East Wing power grid, who had apparently been the kind of person who believed that a king who lived in a building should understand how the building worked. The girl had been teaching herself her dead father's notation system from his books, alone. Since he died 18 months ago when she was 5 years old and had lost the person who would have taught her these things properly, and had apparently decided in the particular way of children who are grieving that learning the thing anyway was better than not learning it. Corvin felt something happen in his chest, something quiet. Not grief exactly, he had enough of his own for that to have a specific shape by now. More like recognition, the specific recognition of one person who keeps working when things get quiet for another. He picked up his own work notebook, found a blank page, wrote out the notation for power flow in her father's system, not coalition standard. This symbol, he said, you've written it here, but the direction marker is facing the wrong way. See the difference? He showed her his version, then hers. When the marker faces this way, it means flow moving toward the junction. When it faces the other way, it means flow moving away. They look similar, but they tell you opposite things. She looked at his notation, then at hers, then back. The slight change in her expression was not dramatic. It was the small, specific shift of someone correcting something they'd been getting wrong and hadn't known it. Oh, she said. Just oh. But the way she said it, the way her face settled into something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it, said something more like, thank you for not leaving me wrong. She took out a small pencil and corrected the markers in her notebook, every one of them going back through several pages. What's your name? She asked while she worked. Corvin. I'm Mira. She said it without looking up from her corrections. Just Mira. No title attached, no designation offered. Either she didn't think it mattered here, or she decided he didn't need it, or she was 7 years old and the formalities were genuinely less interesting than getting the notation right. He didn't correct her. He'd figure out who she was eventually. Right now, she was just Mira, a 7-year-old on the floor of a technical junction, correcting her father's notation system in a worn leather notebook, making sure she got it right. Is it okay if I come back? She asked. He thought about the official, about the restrictions, about the coalition protocols and the diplomatic briefing and the careful perimeter. Everyone in this palace seemed to be maintaining around everything that mattered. He thought about a notebook with direction markers that had been wrong for months and were now being corrected one by one. Yeah, he said, it's okay. She came back the next day and the day after that. By the end of the first week, she'd established a pattern. By the end of the second week, the pattern had become a fixture. She had a designated spot, a particular equipment crate pushed against the wall that she'd apparently decided was hers by right of consistent use, positioned at exactly the angle where she could see what he was working on without being in his way. She brought her notebook every time. She checked her notation against what she was observing. She corrected herself when she was wrong and asked when she wasn't sure. He started leaving small problems visible. Not structuring the work artificially, the work was what it was, but making sure that when something interesting was happening, the interesting part was visible from her crate. The moment when a diagnostic reading shifted from red to yellow, the specific sound a relay made when it was seating correctly versus when it wasn't. The way you could tell from the heat pattern on a component whether the damage was recent or old. She noticed, every time. He didn't say much, she learned anyway. And she talked because she was 7 and 7-year-olds talked, and through her talking he learned things. About the palace and its rhythms, about the staff whom she described with a 7-year-old's perfect unfiltered accuracy that was more useful than any official briefing. About the gardens which she liked considerably more than the staterooms. About her mother whom she described as very busy and very tired and trying very hard in the particular way that children describe parents who were carrying more than children were supposed to see, but always did. About her father, occasionally, and always carefully, the way you were careful with something fragile, not because you were afraid of it, but because you understood its value. Papa used to say that the best engineers listen more than they talk, she said one afternoon. She was checking a diagram she'd drawn against the actual component layout in the junction the way he'd shown her. Because the system is always telling you what's wrong. You just have to know how to hear it. Corvin set down his wrench. He was right, he said. He was right about a lot of things, Mira said. Then she went back to her diagram, and he went back to his work, and neither of them said anything more about it, which was exactly right. Some things didn't need more words. They just needed to be said once clearly and then allowed to sit. The warning came on a Tuesday. Warden Lysa Torrent, the palace household official responsible for staff oversight, a woman with the kind of posture that announced her opinion of you before she opened her mouth. The kind of posture that said, I have been correct about people before, and I am currently being correct about you, appeared at the technical junction with the purposeful stride of someone delivering a message they'd been sent to deliver. Not their own message, someone else's. Engineer Ashtay, Warden, I've been asked to remind you of the terms of your Coalition Access Agreement, specifically those sections pertaining to appropriate interaction with palace household members. He waited. She'd get to it. The Princess Mira has been observed spending considerable time in your work area. This is, she paused, selected her words carefully, not consistent with standard protocols for coalition contractor interaction with members of the royal household. She asks questions, Corvin said. I answer them. Engineer Ashty, I don't seek her out. I don't initiate contact. She comes here on her own initiative and asks questions about the technical work. I answer them. He looked back at the conduit panel. Is there a specific protocol that prohibits answering questions? A pause. Duke Oswald, Lysa Torrent said, and there it was, the name underneath the message. The reason this was happening at all, the thing that turned a protocol reminder into something with actual weight behind it, has expressed concern about the nature of these interactions. Corvin kept his eyes on the panel. Duke Oswald should probably focus on whatever he's actually concerned about, he said, which I don't think is protocol. Silence. The kind of silence that happened when someone was deciding whether to escalate. She decided not to. Please be mindful, she said, of appropriate boundaries. I'm always mindful, he said, of appropriate things. She left. He listened to her footsteps go down the corridor until they were gone. Then he took out his field notebook, the personal one, and wrote down the date, the conversation, the name, Oswald. Added it to the other entries he'd been making, the damage patterns, the component sequences, the timeline of when things had been interfered with, and in what order. And now this, the name of someone who was worried enough about what Corvin might be finding to send an official with a message. That told him something. He hadn't known yet who had done what he'd found in the walls. But you learn things from threats dressed as courtesy. You learn that someone was watching, that someone felt watched in return, that someone had decided a warning was worth the cost of revealing they were paying attention. Duke Oswald was worried enough to send someone, which meant Duke Oswald had something to be worried about. And Duke Oswald knew Corvin was getting closer to what it was. He'd known for 2 weeks that the East Wing damage was deliberate. He didn't know yet who had done it or why. But the pattern required someone with not just knowledge of the system, but legitimate authorized access to the maintenance panels. The kind of access that was documented. The kind that left a trail if you knew what documents to look at and how to read them. He was good at knowing what to look at, and he was patient. Patient work. The kind that nobody noticed until it was done. The kind that Mira's father had apparently also understood given what he'd built in these walls and how carefully he'd built it. He closed the notebook, went back to work. The diplomatic reception was not something Corvin had been invited to. He was there because the technical documentation for the completed East Wing Junction repairs needed to be delivered to the Palace Administrative Office. The actual paper copies, because the Valkyrie Palace administrative system ran on actual paper copies and carbon forms and physical signatures, which was a choice Corvin respected more than he'd expected to, because paper left a record that was harder to quietly modify than a digital file, and the administrative office was accessed through a corridor that ran along the edge of the grand entrance hall. Timing, as it turned out, was comprehensively against him. The reception was already underway when he passed the entrance to the hall. Coalition diplomatic staff, in Valkyrie court officials, in the particular careful arrangement of people who were being professionally cordial to each other and finding it effortful. Formal dress, formal expressions. The particular energy of a room full of people performing goodwill at each other across a table of coalition treaty obligations. He had his toolkit, his documentation folder. He looked exactly like what he was, a contractor who'd taken a wrong turn on the way to an administrative office. He kept walking. He was almost past the entrance when he heard it. His name. Not a formal announcement. Not even particularly loud. Just clear the way, a clear, certain voice carried through stone and crowd and formal atmosphere, as if none of those things were obstacles worth acknowledging. Corvin! He turned. Mira had been standing in formal position beside the raised dais at the far end of the hall. He could see the space she'd vacated, could see the way several court officials were still looking at the empty spot, with expressions ranging from alarmed to privately horrified to professionally uncertain about which response the situation required. Because she wasn't there anymore. She was crossing the hall. In her formal court dress, the real one, the actual formal version with all its ribbons correctly tied, which made it clear that someone had invested significant effort in preparing her for this occasion. Moving at a speed that her formal court dress was absolutely not designed to accommodate. Both arms extended with the specific, complete confidence of someone who has not yet learned that there are rooms where you aren't supposed to run, and occasions when delight is required to wait for permission. She was delighted. There was no other word for it. Not happy, not pleased, delighted. The kind that happens before you can stop it, before you can measure it against what's appropriate, the kind that belongs to children and to people who have forgotten, for one unguarded moment, to be careful. He had approximately 3 seconds. He set down the documentation folder, and he knelt. He went down on one knee on the marble floor of the grand entrance hall of the Valkyrie Royal Palace, in the middle of a formal diplomatic reception in his work clothes, with his toolkit at his side, and his calloused hands, and his unremarkable contractor's face. He went down to her level, because that was what you did when someone was coming toward you with their arms out and all that delight. Because meeting someone where they were was basic decency, and basic decency didn't get suspended because the room was expensive. She reached him and held on, and he steadied her with both hands, the way you steadied a child who'd arrived at significant velocity without planning to decelerate. "Princess," he said. His voice was warm but quiet-pitched so that only she heard the warmth, and everyone else in the hall heard only appropriate professional acknowledgement. "You're supposed to be at the reception. I saw you from the stairs," she said, entirely unbothered by the diplomatic complexity surrounding them. "You were walking fast." "I was trying not to interrupt." "You weren't interrupting." She pulled back enough to look at him with those direct eyes. "You were just there." He heard footsteps from the direction of the dais. Measured. Deliberate. Each one placed with the specific intention of someone who had decided what each step meant before taking it. He looked up. Queen Caroline Voss. He'd seen her in passing through corridor doorways at the edge of formal proceedings that had no role for him. He'd formed an impression from those glimpses, tall, controlled, the specific kind of controlled, that required ongoing effort rather than coming naturally. Dark hair, the silver at her temples, that appeared in Valkyrie physiology as a marker of acute grief rather than age. He'd read that in the cultural briefing materials. Eyes that were taking in everything they looked at and offering nothing back. She was taking in him now, and Mira, in the space between them and what was in it. He rose, slowly, the way you rose when you wanted to make it clear you weren't rushing. Anything weren't trying to force any moment to move faster than it wanted to. He held the formal bow that Valkyrie protocol required. He'd read the briefing. He followed the protocol, and then he said because the silence needed someone to break it, and he was the one who'd caused the situation. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the disruption. The princess surprised me. I should have managed the situation more smoothly." Not apologizing for Mira, not implying she'd done something wrong because she hadn't, not in any way that mattered beyond this room's particular rules. But the awkwardness, the interruption of the formal proceedings, the moment of uncertainty that had rippled through the assembled court officials, that much was his to own, and he owned it. Caroline looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing several things simultaneously, assessing him, assessing the situation, assessing what had just happened against what she knew of her daughter and what she'd been told, and what she was now seeing for herself. "Engineer Ashtay," she said. Her voice was even. carefully, professionally even. You have been working in the East Wing for 3 months. Yes, Your Majesty. My daughter has spent a considerable portion of those 3 months in your work area. She has questions, he said, about the systems. I've tried to answer them in a way that's appropriate to the situation. Appropriately. She repeated the word, not with sarcasm, more the way you repeated something when you were testing its weight, seeing if it held what it claimed to hold. Then Mira, a slight pause before the name, the smallest hesitation, as if another name had almost come out first. Perhaps you might return to your position. Yes, mother, Mira said in the particular tone of a child who had been gently corrected and was choosing compliance without distress. She turned back to Corvin with the practical directness that was apparently just how she engaged with everything. Will you still be in the West Corridor Junction tomorrow? That's where the work is, he said. Okay, completely satisfied. As if the entire diplomatic reception and its attendant complications were simply background noise that didn't require her attention. I'll find it. She walked back to her position, head up. The loose ribbon had stayed loose throughout. The assembled court officials watched her return with a collective expression of people revising their understanding of a situation. Saraline watched her daughter. And Corvin, because he had nothing to gain from anything except the truth, and because the truth here seemed worth the cost of offering it, said quietly enough that only she could hear. She's been teaching herself her father's notation system. From his books. A pause. She had the direction markers wrong on 2 of the symbols. She's corrected them now. A silence. Not the careful diplomatic silence of people being professionally cordial to each other. Something else. Something that had nothing to do with the reception, or the court officials, or the coalition representatives, or any of it. Saraline turned from watching Mira to looking at him. And for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment before the control came back, her expression was something he didn't have a word for in any language he knew. It felt like recognition. Like someone seeing something they'd believed was gone and finding it still present, changed in form, but still itself. Then the control returned, smooth, practiced, the expression of a queen at a formal reception. Engineer Ashty, she said. Your Majesty? Davin. She directed the name sideways toward the older man who had materialized quietly at the edge of the dais with the particular skill of senior advisors who had learned that being present without announcing themselves was more useful than announcing themselves. Note that I would like to speak with Engineer Ashty, at his convenience, in the coming week. Noted, Your Majesty, the old man said. Corvin looked at the Queen. The Queen looked at him. Something shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. The way things shifted when something that had been moving in one direction started slowly and without fanfare to consider another. He picked up his documentation folder from where he'd set it on the marble floor. He gave the formal bow again. He walked the rest of the way to the administrative office, delivered his paper copies, got his signatures, and walked back through corridors that had learned over 3 months to give him space. In his room that night, the small contractor's room at the edge of the service wing, plain and functional, and nothing like his quiet kitchen at home, he took out the personal field notebook. He didn't write about the reception, not about the Queen's expression or the way Mira's ribbon had stayed loose, or the specific weight of kneeling on marble in a room full of diplomats. He wrote about the East Wing Junction, the components, the damage pattern, the name he'd added 2 weeks ago, Oswald. And underneath it now a question, not what did you do? He was getting close to knowing that. But why does this matter enough to warn me? What is it about a coalition contractor asking the right questions in the right walls that is worth the risk of showing your hand? He'd been in this palace for 3 months. He'd been invisible by design, by preference, by the invisibility that competent workers learned when they understood that visibility was its own kind of problem. You couldn't do the work if people were watching the work and deciding what it meant. But something had changed tonight. He wasn't certain yet whether it was good, but the Queen wanted to speak with him, and Mira would find the West Corridor Junction tomorrow. And the East Wing lights, the ones that had been running dim and cold on backup power for 7 months through a winter, this palace had spent in grief, were one by one coming back on. He closed the notebook, looked at the ceiling. The ceiling at least had no opinions about any of it. He'd take that for tonight. Part 2. The things that don't go in reports. The meeting with the Queen didn't happen the following week. It happened the week after, on a Wednesday, in a small receiving room off the main corridor that was clearly not the formal throne room, and just as clearly not chosen by accident. Someone had thought about this room. Small table, 2 chairs, no advisors positioned along the walls. No court officials stationed at careful distances with their careful faces. Just Sarah Voss and him. And tea that sat between them and did nothing for anyone. She was already seated when he arrived, which told him something. She hadn't staged the entrance, hadn't made him wait in the corridor while she arranged herself at an angle of authority. Either she didn't use those tools, or she'd decided they were unnecessary here. He hoped it was the first one. "Sit down, Engineer Ashty." He sat. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the reception hall, like she was working something out, like he was a problem that had arrived through an unexpected door, and she hadn't yet decided how to categorize it. "You've been here 4 months, she said. "Yes." "The East Wing restoration, how far along?" 70%. "The remaining work is in the deeper conduit lines. Another 6 to 8 weeks depending on what I find." "And you intend to complete it?" "That's why I'm here." She was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone who spoke carefully and saw no value in filling space with words that weren't doing anything. "My daughter," she said, "has started incorporating technical notation into her personal correspondence." Corvin said nothing. "Her morning lesson notes last Tuesday," Sarah continued, "were submitted to her tutor in a combination of standard script and what the tutor described as an unknown symbolic system." The tutor was quite distressed. "It's not unknown," Corvin said. "It's your husband's notation system, the one he developed to design the original East Wing grid." Silence. "I know what it is," Sarah said, quietly, without inflection. "I've seen it before." And there was something in those 4 words that was not about technical notation at all. Something that was about a woman who had watched her husband work late at those specific symbols on papers left on his desk, who had seen them and not understood them, and been shown what they meant, who knew exactly what it had cost him to develop them, and what it meant that her 7-year-old daughter had decided to learn them from his books alone in the 18 months since he'd stopped being there to teach her anything. "She had 2 of the direction markers wrong," Corvin said. "She's corrected them now." Sarah looked at him. "You told her." "I showed her. She corrected herself." A different silence, different weight. "Why?" Sarah asked. He thought about it. Actually thought because it deserved an actual answer rather than a polite one. "Because she was wrong and she wanted to be right," he said. "And because the system her father built means more when it's understood correctly. Leaving her with the wrong version seemed like the wrong kind of respect for the work." Sarah set her hands flat on the table, looked at them. "Duke Oswald," she said, "has filed a formal concern with my advisory council regarding the scope of your access and the nature of your interactions with members of the royal household." "I assumed something like that was coming," Corvin said. "He's framing it as a protocol matter. Inappropriate, unsanctioned contact between coalition contractors and royal household members." "And what are you framing it as?" She looked up, not surprised by the directness, more as though she'd been waiting to see if it would appear. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "That's part of why you're here." He could respect that. Honesty about process was worth something. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me," she said, "about your work in the East Wing, beyond what appears in your official reports?" He looked at her. She looked at him. He made a decision. "The damage to the East Wing grid wasn't caused by the conflict," he said. "It was deliberate interference. Precise, systematic, and performed by someone who understood the system from the inside." Not a flicker of expression changed, which told him either she already knew or she was extraordinary at this. Both were possible. Both were worth filing. "Those are significant words," she said. "I know." "Do you have documentation?" "In my personal field notes, not in the official project log. I wanted to fully understand what I was seeing before I put it in an official report." "And do you understand it fully yet?" "Not completely, but enough to know it wasn't accidental." She nodded once. Small, controlled. Engineer Ashti, she said, I would ask that you continue exercising your own judgment about what enters official reports and what does not. For the time being. A pause. Understood, he said. She stood. He stood. The tea had gone cold and untouched, and would go on being both. At the door with her back at a slight angle toward him, she said, My daughter hasn't laughed like that since her father died. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out each step exactly what she intended, and the door closed behind her with the specific quiet of something that had been well made. Corvin stood in the receiving room for a moment, looked at the cold tea, thought about several things, went back to work. Davin Crost found him on a Thursday. Not sent, not dispatched through the palace's bureaucratic channels. Found him personally walking into the West Corridor Junction with his hands clasped behind his back and his silver-haired old man's face wearing the expression of someone who had seen enough of the world to have stopped performing responses to it. Davin was 61, the kind of 61 that had been built by decades of watching people make decisions and understanding what those decisions actually meant, rather than what people claim they meant. He walked in and looked at the open access panel with the attention of someone who had spent 61 years learning that the most important things were usually inside walls rather than in front of them. Engineer Ashtay, Lord Crost, Davin is fine. He looked at the panel. May I? Corvin gestured. Davin crouched, which was genuinely impressive at 61, the kind of thing that told you a man had either spent his life physically active or was simply refusing to acknowledge certain bodily limitations on principle. He looked at the conduit layout, at the components, at the specific section Corvin had been documenting for 3 weeks. Stood up. You know what you're looking at, Davin said. Not a question. I know what I'm looking at, Corvin agreed. And you haven't reported it officially. Not yet. Davin looked at him, really looked. The look of someone deciding whether to trust another person, not with a secrets were manageable, but with the weight of having a secret, which was harder and more costly and required a different kind of judgment. Duke Oswald, Davin said, controls infrastructure contract allocation for the Eastern Coalition territories. He's held that position for 6 years. He determines which contracts get issued, which budgets get approved, which timelines get extended, and which get accelerated. A pause. A palace grid that requires ongoing coalition repair represents a recurring budget line. A functional grid does not. Corvin was quiet. How long, he asked. We believe the interference began before the territorial conflict ended. The conflict provided useful cover damage that occurred during active military engagement was automatically attributed to ordnance. After the conflict ended, the damage needed to continue appearing consistent with that attribution. He had someone who understood the system. He controls who has authorized access to the system. That's what contract allocation authority means in practice. Corvin looked at his field notebook, at 8 weeks of documentation, at a picture that was close to complete. What do you need from me? He asked. And Davin did something unexpected. He sat down. On the floor back against the wall with the movement of a man setting down something heavy that he'd been carrying for long enough that putting it down even briefly was a relief. Keep doing what you're doing, he said. Document everything. Continue building the record. Don't report through official coalition channels yet, and don't let Oswald understand how much ground you've covered. He already suspects I found something. He suspects a contractor noticed something inconvenient and might say something inconvenient. He doesn't know a contractor has been building a systematic evidentiary record for 8 weeks. Davin looked at him steadily. Those are different situations. They were. Corvin sat down on the floor across from him, back against the opposite wall. 2 men in a corridor facing each other. Why trust me? Corvin asked. You don't know me. I know you didn't report immediately, Davin said, which means you were thinking before acting. I know you've been documenting methodically rather than reactively. I know you said okay to my queen when she asked you to use your judgment, and you've been using it correctly since. A pause. And I know that the right people made their assessments of you some time ago. I'm simply confirming them. Corvin thought about that. Okay, he said. Just okay. But Davin nodded as if it covered everything that needed covering. They sat on the floor of the West Corridor Junction for a while after that, not filling the silence, just letting it be what it was. Two people who had both spent a long time doing work that happened in places nobody watched for results that sometimes came and sometimes didn't, with no guarantee either way, and had both made their peace with that particular uncertainty. The work was the work. The outcome was separate. You could only control one of them. The conversation with Sarah Lynn happened by accident, which was probably the only way it could have happened honestly. By design, by appointment, by formal arrangement, by one of them seeking the other out, it would have been managed. It would have had appropriate distances built into it and things left unsaid because the architecture of deliberate meetings encouraged leaving things unsaid. But it was late, well past the hour when the service corridors were empty. Corvin had been working on a particularly resistant conduit junction in the Lower East Passage, the last of the major problem sections, the one that had required 3 separate diagnostic approaches before he'd understood what was actually wrong with it, and he'd lost track of time in the way that happened when a stubborn problem was finally starting to yield. He came around a corner with his toolkit, and there she was. No attendants, no Davin at a discreet distance, no Warden Torrent positioned somewhere she could observe without appearing to. Just Caroline Voss, wearing a coat that was slightly too large for her. A man's coat he registered old and well-made, and clearly not chosen from her own wardrobe, standing in the corridor, holding a candle because the backup power in this section was still inconsistent, and she'd apparently decided that was a manageable condition. She turned when she heard him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was honest in the direct way of someone who had stopped bothering with the social version of that answer and was just saying the true one. "The lower junction," he said, gesturing at his toolkit. "I lost track of the time. Did you fix it?" "Yes." "Good." She looked at the candle for a moment. "I used to walk at night with Edrin, when neither of us could sleep. He said the palace was different at night, that you could hear what it actually was without everything else on top of it." She hadn't meant to say that. He could tell. It had come out the way things came out when you were tired, and the corridor was empty at an hour when performances weren't required. "He was right," Corvin said. "It is quieter." He was right about most things. A pause. The slight wryness that he'd heard once before briefly at the reception, the specific wryness of someone who is still capable of finding things absurd, which was its own kind of resilience. Except regarding his own mortality. He seemed to consider himself exempt from that particular universal. Something shifted in the corridor. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a small adjustment in the air between two people who had both been carrying something heavy and had both just for a moment set it down. "You told Davin," she said, "about the deliberate damage." "Yes. Not the official coalition channels." "Not yet. Oswald has connections at the coalition administrative level. An official report through standard channels would reach people who have reasons to make it disappear before it reaches people who don't. And Davin's approach takes longer, requires building the case through Valkyrie legal frameworks rather than coalition protocols, but it reaches people who can actually act on it. She was looking at him steadily, the candle between them. "You've thought through the entire chain," she said. "I think most things through. And if Oswald moves against you before Davin has what he needs..." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Then I get sent home," he said. "And Davin uses what I've already documented and finds another path. And Oswald keeps his contracts for another year or two before something else brings it down." A pause. "It's not the outcome I'd choose, but it's not a failure. You'd accept being sent away quietly, without seeing it resolved." "I'd prefer to see it resolved," he said. "But I've been in situations before where I did the right thing correctly, and the outcome still went the wrong way. You learn to make your peace with that, because the alternative is doing the wrong thing, and that has worse outcomes in every direction." The candle flickered slightly. Neither of them moved. "Adrian said something close to that," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hand tightened slightly on the candle just enough to notice. "He said the only way to demonstrate that you're right is to continue being right, even when no one is watching, even when it hasn't mattered yet." Corvin didn't say anything. Because sometimes the right thing was not words. Sometimes the right thing was staying present. Being still, not filling the space with something smaller than what had just been offered into it. They stood in the corridor for another moment. Two people who had each, through different losses and different years and different kinds of work, figured out that you didn't stop being yourself when the person who saw you most clearly was gone. You just kept going. Being yourself continued to be what it had always been, the only real option when you looked at the alternatives, honestly. The coat was his, she said, finally, not asking for acknowledgement, just saying it the way you said things when you were tired enough to just let them be true. I know, he said. She looked at him. How? It's too large for you, and it's the kind of coat someone keeps when there's no practical reason to keep it. A different silence. The kind that meant something had been understood without anyone needing to explain it. The kind that felt briefly like rest. "Good night, Engineer Ashty," she said. "Good night, Your Majesty." She walked down the corridor with the candle. He watched the light move until the turn took it. Then he stood in the dark for a moment, thought about his own quiet kitchen, his own two large spaces, the cup he still automatically reached for. You kept going. You stayed yourself. That was the whole of it, really. He picked up his toolkit and went to write his notes. Mira found out on a Friday. Corvin didn't know it had happened until he arrived at the West Junction the following morning, and she wasn't there. Which was wrong. She was always there by the time he arrived. Sometimes before him, sitting on her crate, with the notebook already open and her pencil already moving, which he'd privately concluded was either remarkable time management or evidence that she genuinely slept less than she should. But that morning the crate was empty. He started his work, told himself children had lessons, obligations, mornings when the junction wasn't the priority. Told himself this several times with decreasing conviction over the course of an hour. Then he heard footsteps. Running, small, moving at maximum speed with complete commitment to the destination. He turned. Mira came around the corner at a pace that her dress was not designed for and had clearly not been consulted about. She stopped, looked at him. Her expression was wrong. Not the Mira he'd learned over 4 months. Not the direct, certain questions, already prepared Mira, who arrived with a notebook and left with answers and treated everything in between as entirely manageable. This Mira had been crying. Not recently she'd stopped, had composed herself with what was clearly significant effort, her chin doing the specific thing that children's chins did when they were holding something in by force of will alone. Her eyes were red. Her notebook was pressed against her chest with both hands, like it was the thing keeping her upright. "Is it true?" she asked. He set down his wrench. "Is what true that you're leaving?" Her voice was level. She was working very hard at level. "Warden Torrent told Lady Essen, who told my morning attendant, that your contract is being reviewed and that you're not going to be here anymore." He was quiet for a moment. He thought through several responses, the reassuring ones, the technically accurate but incomplete ones, the ones adults used when they wanted to have the conversation without actually having it. He decided against all of them. "There are people," he said, "who would prefer I wasn't here. They're working on arranging that." "Oswald," she said. He looked at her. "Mira, I'm not a baby," she said, flat, certain, with the specific dignity of a 7-year-old who had spent 18 months watching adults systematically underestimate how much she understood about what was happening around her. "I know about Oswald. I know he's been telling Mother's Council that there's something inappropriate about you being here. It's not true. What he's saying about you isn't true." "No," Corvin said. "It's not." "So why is Mother—" "She's not," he said. "She's thinking there's a difference." Mira looked at him, then at the junction panel, then at her notebook, and then she did something that surprised him. She sat down on her crate, opened the notebook, set it on her knees, pencil ready. "Show me the tertiary bypass sequence," she said. "The one we haven't covered yet." "Mira, if you're leaving," she said without looking up, "I need to know the tertiary bypass so I can check it myself if something goes wrong and there's nobody here who knows what to look for." The same thing happened in his chest that had happened the first day when he'd seen the direction markers. The same quiet recognition, but larger this time, deeper. "Okay," he said. He showed her the tertiary bypass sequence, all of it. She took notes with the precision she'd been developing for 4 months. Every direction marker correct, every symbol exactly what it meant. Neither of them talked about leaving. But she stayed 4 hours that day instead of 2. And when she finally had to go, she looked back from the corridor doorway with the expression of someone memorizing something they were afraid of forgetting. He knew that expression. He'd worn it before. 3 days later, Corvin returned to his room to find it had been searched. Not ransacked, nothing so crude. Just the specific wrongness of things that had been moved and replaced by someone who was skilled at replacing things, but not quite skilled enough. His field notebooks, both of them had been moved. He placed them at a specific angle on the desk always, and the angle was wrong. His official project log had been shifted. His personal notebook had been moved and returned to approximately the right position, which meant someone had looked at both and taken care to put them back. The toolkit was untouched. The toolkit wasn't what they were looking for. He sat on the edge of his bed, thought about Oswald, about timing, about what it meant that the search had happened now after his conversation with Davin, after the formal complaint to the council, after Mira had spent 4 hours learning the tertiary bypass, and looked back from the doorway like she was memorizing the room. They were accelerating, which meant the timeline had compressed, which meant Davin's careful, patient legal framework needed to move faster than they'd planned. He took out his personal field notebook. Not to add more documentation, there was nothing new to add. To write a summary. Clear, organized, self-contained. The kind of document that told its own story without requiring the person who wrote it to be present to explain it. The kind you wrote when you were preparing for the possibility that the work would continue without you. He wrote until midnight, then he slept. Then the thing with Mira happened. It started with Lady Essen appearing at the junction the following morning, one of Myra's household attendants, a woman who maintained professional calm as a matter of professional necessity, and who was currently maintaining it with visible effort. Engineer Ashty, we have a situation in the residential wing. The situation was coming from the small utility alcove adjacent to Mira's personal chambers where the residential power connections ran. Specifically, the situation was the sounds a utility alcove made when someone with 3 days of tertiary bypass training and determined intention was attempting to reroute primary junction connections. He was brought through corridors he'd never had access to before, past guards who looked at him with expressions distributed across the range from suspicious to baffled, to something that in his experience most closely resembled desperate relief. The door to the utility alcove was open. Mira was inside, cross-legged on the floor, which was apparently her preferred working position, regardless of location. His toolkit, which she had borrowed without mentioning this plan to him, and which they were going to discuss, was open beside her. She had the access panel open, the diagnostic scanner in one hand, her notebook in the other. The lights in her room, which had been running on backup power for the 18 months since the interference had begun, were flickering, which meant she'd successfully reached the primary junction, which meant she'd attempted to reroute around the backup system, which meant she was one incorrectly seated relay away from losing power to the entire residential wing. She looked up at him, not scared, not apologetic, focused. The expression of someone in the middle of a problem they have not yet solved but have not given up on either. I got the tertiary bypass to work, she said, but the primary junction relay isn't responding the way you said it would. Mira. I know. She held up her notebook open to the diagram she'd drawn. I followed the sequence exactly, but this component, she pointed, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. He crouched down, looked at the relay, looked at her diagram. She had followed the sequence correctly. Every step, every marker, every notation in the right direction. The relay wasn't responding because it was one of the components that had been deliberately damaged in the original interference, a fault that didn't appear in the standard repair sequence because the standard repair sequence assumed standard damage. She'd done everything right. The system was the problem, not her. Don't tell me to stop, she said. I'm not going to tell you to stop. She blinked. I'm going to show you why the relay isn't responding, he said, and then you're going to fix it correctly. And then we're going to discuss using my toolkit without asking. You would have said no. I would have said not without me here, which is basically no, which is basically not yet. There's a difference. She considered this. tilted her head at the angle she used when she was actually processing something rather than just hearing it. That is different. Yes, he said. It is. He showed her the relay, the specific damage, the way around it, the correct approach. She took notes. She asked 3 questions. Each question was sharper than the one before it. She rerouted the connection herself with him, watching with his hands ready at a distance that meant available if needed rather than doing it for you. The lights came on, not the dim yellow of backup power running past its design limits, not the cold, uncertain light that the residential wing had been living under for 18 months. Full primary power, warm, steady. The light this palace had been designed to run on, built into the walls by a man who'd understood exactly what he was building and why. Mira looked at the lights, then at her hands, then at him. "Papa's system works," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It does." Neither of them said anything else, because the moment was complete. Adding anything to it would have made it less. Saralyn was in the doorway. He didn't know how long she'd been there, long enough to have seen most of what mattered. Her expression was complicated, the complicated kind that happened when the simplest truths arrived at moments when you hadn't prepared yourself for them. She was looking at Mira in the full light, and at Corvin crouched on the floor with the borrowed toolkit, and at the notebook open between them, her dead husband's notation system written out in their daughter's careful 7-year-old hand, every direction marker correct. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Corvin stood, gathered the borrowed components of his toolkit carefully. He nodded at Saralyn, once professional, appropriate, all the correct distances maintained. Then he looked at Mira. "Ask next time," he said. "Okay." "I mean it." "I know," she said. "I'll ask next time." He went back to the junction. Behind him down the residential corridor, the lights stayed on. He heard it as he walked, Saralyn's voice low and without its usual careful modulation, saying something to her daughter. And Mira's response. And then a silence that was not empty. The other kind. The kind that meant something had settled that wasn't going to unsettle. He kept walking. That afternoon, Davin was sitting in the single chair in Corvin's room when Corvin returned. He'd apparently let himself in, which Corvin registered and decided was fine, because they were well past the stage where pretending to maintain boundaries was serving any real purpose. "She's going to move," Davin said. No preamble. None of the pleasantries they'd occasionally performed. "Oswald, Saralyn." Davin was looking at his hands. "I've seen her reach this point twice before. Once when Edrin was in danger during the border negotiations. Once when Mira was seriously ill the winter she was 3. He paused. She gets very still, very quiet. And then she does something that no one was expecting. Corvin sat on the edge of his bed. "The documentation," he said. "Is it enough yet?" "Almost." Davin looked up. "I need a few more days. Perhaps a week." He searched my room. "I know. He'll move before a week." "I know." A long pause. "I need you to trust that she'll move first." Corvin thought about the corridor at night. A candle. A coat that was too large. The specific wryness of someone who was still capable of finding things absurd, which was more than some people managed after what she'd been through. He thought about a 7-year-old who had learned a dead man's system from his books because it was the only way left to keep learning from him. He thought about rooms that were too quiet and the automatic reach for a cup that wasn't needed. He thought about the work, always the work, the thing that persisted regardless. "Okay," he said. "Just okay." Davin nodded once. The week had already started. Part 3, What Stays. The notice came on a Monday, which felt wrong. Mondays were for starting things, not for this. It was official. Coalition letterhead, formal language that used many words to say very little while meaning something quite significant. Contract under administrative review. Access suspended pending resolution of outstanding protocol concerns. Engineer Ashtay requested to report to the service departure office by end of week for exit processing. Corvin read it twice, folded it carefully along its original creases, put it in his jacket pocket. Then he went back to work. Because the conduit in the Lower East Passage still needed its final checks. Because his field documentation still needed organizing into its summary form. because stopping had never been something he was good at, and this seemed like the worst possible time to develop the habit. He worked through the morning, he worked through lunch. Ren Galoy appeared at the junction entrance at some point, the young technician who'd come out on the same train and was finishing up the secondary repair work. He stood there for a moment and said carefully, "I heard about the review." "Yeah," Corvin said. "Is there anything?" "No." Ren nodded, stayed for a few minutes in the way of someone who understood that presence was sometimes its own form of the thing, even when there was nothing practical to offer. Then he left. And Corvin kept working. He finished the Lower East Passage final checks at 3:30, stood back and looked at the completed section. Done. He took out the official project log and made the final entry for that section. Date, time, current status, maintenance recommendations for whoever came after. All of it correct and clear and useful without him needing to be there to explain it. Then he took out the personal field notebook. 8 weeks of documentation, component numbers and dates, and the specific pattern of interference that pointed clearly and without ambiguity, requiring interpretation, to someone who had both the technical knowledge and the authorized access to do it deliberately. The summary he'd written at midnight organized into a form that told its own story, self-contained, self-explanatory. He clipped it shut. Tomorrow he'd find Davin, because Davin had asked for time and the time wasn't up, because he'd said okay and okay meant something, because whatever happened with his contract, this part, the part about the palace and Oswald, and the money extracted from a kingdom in grief through deliberate sabotage, wasn't finished yet. And unfinished work handed off properly was worth more than finished work carried away. He went back to his room, started packing, which was not a dramatic process. He didn't have much. The toolkit which had always mattered more than anything else he traveled with. Clothes, the notebooks, a photograph in the inner pocket of his bag, his wife in the garden of their house looking at something to the left of the camera and laughing at whatever it was. He always packed that one last. He packed it last. Then he sat on the edge of his bed in the quiet. A different quiet than home, but quiet in the way all quiet was ultimately the same, the absence of the people who should be in it. He thought about Mira, about the lights coming on, about the way she'd looked at her hands and said, "Papa's system works," with the specific wonder of someone discovering that the person they lost left something behind that still functions, still works, still lights up the spaces it was built to light up. That was the thing about good work. It didn't disappear when the person who did it was gone. It stayed in the walls, kept things running, kept the lights on. He thought about that for a while. Then he went to find Mira, because he wasn't leaving today, and she deserved to know the truth before the palace communicated it to her through whatever channel the palace was planning to use. She was in the garden. Her usual spot, the low stone bench near the eastern wall where the afternoon light came in at a good angle, and she could spread her notebook out without anyone suggesting she find a more appropriate location. She had her notebook. She had a small arrangement of practice components on the bench beside her, the kind she'd been using to learn the bypass sequences by feel rather than just by diagram. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Knew. He could see it in her face before he said a word. Children always knew. They just waited to find out if the adult was going to be honest about it. He sat on the other end of the bench. She looked at the components arranged on the stone between them. "They're sending you home," she said. "Yes." "Because of Oswald." "The official reason is a contract review." "But because of Oswald." "Yes." She was quiet. Her hand rested on the components, not fidgeting, just resting like she needed something solid under her palm. "Is it permanent?" she asked. He thought about how to answer that honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I hope not." "But you don't know?" "No, I don't know." She nodded, small. The specific contained dignity that had always been part of her, that had nothing to do with being royal and everything to do with being who she was. "Okay," she said, "just okay." And then, because she was Mira and had never in 4 months wasted a moment on things that couldn't be changed. "Show me the full maintenance sequence for the primary residential junction. All of it. I want to write it down before you go." Mira. "I know it won't be the same," she said, not asking for anything, just stating a fact she'd already accepted. "But I want to know it. in case something happens and there's nobody here who understands how the system was actually built. The coalition will send someone who doesn't know Papa's notation, she said. Someone who'll look at what's in these walls and see damage without understanding the design underneath it. She met his eyes directly the way she always did. I want there to be at least one person here who knows how it was meant to work. He sat with that for a moment, because she was right, not just about the technical necessity of it, though she was right about that too. Right about something larger, about what it meant to understand something from its foundation rather than its surface, about what her father had built and what that deserved. He took out his notebook, and he gave her the full maintenance sequence. Every step, every notation, every specific fault in the current system, with the reasoning behind each repair. He talked and she wrote, and neither of them made it about anything other than the work. But it was about everything. When they finished, he reached into his toolkit, the small set he'd been assembling for a month without letting himself acknowledge what it was for. A child-sized wrench properly balanced for hands smaller than his. A diagnostic scanner calibrated for the residential system's specific parameters. 3 relay components, the kind that failed most often under the conditions of the East Wing damage, the kind you wanted to have on hand before you needed them. He set it on the bench between them. Don't use these without an adult present, he said. She looked at the toolkit, at the wrench that fit her hand. You said not yet before. I'm revising that to not without an adult present. That's different. A little bit different, he agreed. She picked up the wrench, turned it in her hands, looked at it the way you looked at something that was not just a thing. I'll be careful, she said. I know you will. He stood. She stood. For a moment, they were both just standing in the garden in the afternoon light. Full primary power light, now warm and steady, the way the palace had been designed to be lit, and neither of them said anything. If you come back, she said. When, he said. She looked at him. When I come back, he said. Not if. She thought about that. He could see her decide to believe it, not blindly, not from hope alone, but because she'd assessed the situation and decided it was a reasonable thing to believe. Okay, she said. When? He walked back inside. He did not look back. Because if he looked back, he would see her standing in the garden with the toolkit, in the notebook, in the afternoon light, and he would know that leaving was the wrong shape for this story, even if it was the only shape currently available, and he needed to be able to keep walking. So he kept walking. The morning he was set to leave, Corvin rose before the palace did. He dressed, finished packing, did a last check of the room, not because he'd left anything behind, but because he always did a last check. Leave the space as you found it. Take only what's yours. Old habit from 30 years of service rooms and contractor quarters and temporary assignments. He went to find Davin, not to ask for anything, not to request a different outcome or more time or an intervention, just to deliver what he'd built. Davin was already awake. Of course he was. People who carried weight slept lightly. It was one of the universal laws of the thing. Corvin set the personal field notebook on the desk. It's all there, he said. The summary section is at the end. It's written to stand alone. You don't need me present to explain it. Davin looked at the notebook, then at him. You're not going to fight the review. Fighting it through official coalition channels is exactly what Oswald is prepared for. He has responses to that. He doesn't have a response to what's in that notebook used correctly through the right framework. Davin was quiet for a moment. The time I asked for, he said. I gave you what I had, Corvin said. The rest is yours now. Use it well. Davin stood, held out his hand. Corvin shook it. 2 men. No performance required. Just the weight of work completed and passed on and trusted to continue without the person who'd started it. She's going to move today, Davin said. Whatever it looks like, whatever it seems to mean from where you're standing, she's going to move today. Corvin didn't ask what that meant. He picked up his bag, his toolkit, the photograph in the inner pocket, and he walked toward the service exit. The palace was quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath. Stone corridors and high ceilings, and the light's primary power warm and full, every wing finally running the way its designer had intended it to run, all of it just there. Solid. complete, itself. Passing through the east wing, he put his hand against the wall for a moment. Just a moment. Because he'd spent months inside these walls learning their systems, understanding what had been broken and how and why, and what it would take to put it right. And there was something not sentimental exactly, but close enough to matter about leaving a place you'd fixed before you'd had much time to see it work properly. He took his hand off the wall, kept going. Past the administrative corridor, past the staff quarters, down through the service wing toward the eastern grounds. He went the long way around the garden along the eastern path because the eastern path was clean and clear, and he didn't want to walk through the garden at this hour and look at the stone bench with the practice components and think about small hands. He didn't think about it. He thought about the train, about the ride back through the borderlands that were almost beautiful and then weren't, about the kitchen at home and the cup and the particular silence that had driven him here in the first place. It would still be there. That was fine. He'd managed it before. He'd manage it again. He pushed through the service gate, stopped, because there was a vehicle. Coalition marking service configuration parked in a way that said it had been there for a while and wasn't going anywhere imminently. And beside it, leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had decided that waiting was a choice he was making, rather than something being done to him, was a young Coalition liaison officer. Engineer Ashtay. Yes, there's a message. The officer held out an envelope. From the Palace Administrative Office. Corvin looked at the envelope. He knew what official communications from the Palace Administrative Office looked like. He'd received several over 5 months. This was the right weight, the right seal. Another formal notice, probably. Exit processing details. The bureaucratic language of a situation being concluded. He opened it, read it again. Valkyrie Administrative Formal. The most formal register there was, which was saying something significant given the field it was competing in. But the content was clear, precise, unambiguous in the way that things written by someone who understood systems were unambiguous. By order of Queen Saralyn Voss of the Valkyrie Royal Sovereignty, in recognition of exceptional technical service rendered to the palace infrastructure and demonstrated independent professional conduct, Engineer Corvin Ashtay is hereby appointed to the position of Independent Royal Technical Advisor, effective immediately upon acceptance. Said position is established outside the framework of existing coalition infrastructure contracts. It is not subject to administrative review under coalition protocols. It is not contingent on coalition approval, extension, or renewal. Said position is personal, specific, non-transferable. He read it a third time, put it carefully in his jacket pocket next to the other notice. The liaison officer was watching him with the expression of someone who had been specifically instructed not to editorialize and was honoring that instruction. Is a response required? Corvin asked. I was told, the officer said, to wait for your answer. Corvin looked at the palace, at the east wing where all the lights were on, at the garden wall visible from this angle behind which a stone bench sat empty in the early morning, at the towers that didn't point so much as reach. He thought about what Davin had said. She's going to move today. Not if. When. He had one question. Only one. Is there a way to get a message back to the palace before I go? He asked. Yes, sir. Tell them. He stopped, reconsidered. Actually, don't. Some things should be said in person. The liaison officer nodded with the relief of someone who had not wanted to interpret an ambiguous message. Corvin picked up his bag, walked back through the service gate, down the eastern path back the way he'd come, past the garden, and this time he looked because now it was okay to look, because he was walking towards something instead of away from it. And the garden was golden in the early light, and the stone bench was just a stone bench in a garden, and the eastern wall was just stone and morning, and nothing that needed to hurt. He kept walking, into the main corridor, into the interior of the palace that was his workplace and not his home, and was starting to feel like the kind of place that could matter in a different way than home mattered. And then, footsteps, small, fast, the rhythm of someone covering ground at maximum speed with total commitment. He turned. Mira came around the corner at a velocity that suggested she had been informed of the situation, or had figured it out, or had simply known the way, she sometimes seemed to know things just slightly before she should have been able to know them. She was in her morning dress, hair not yet arranged properly, notebook in one hand, the small toolkit in the other. Apparently she'd kept it close or close enough to grab on the way out. She stopped, looked at him. He looked at her. "You came back," she said. "I said when," he said. "Not if." She looked at him for exactly one more second, and then she crossed the corridor at the same speed she'd crossed the grand entrance hall 5 months ago, with the same complete disregard for what was appropriate, with the same unguarded certainty that this was simply the right thing to do, and the surroundings could arrange themselves accordingly. He went down on one knee, because that was what you did. Meeting people where they were was basic decency, and basic decency didn't get suspended because you were tired or the floor was stone or there was nobody there to see it. She held on. He steadied her. In the corridor in the morning light, he held on too, because some things were just true, regardless of category, regardless of what the coalition protocols said about appropriate contact between contractors and royal household members, regardless of anything except that it was true. Over Mira's shoulder, he became aware of a presence at the far end of the corridor, not intruding, not announcing itself, just there the way Saralyn was sometimes there, present without making a production of the presence. She was standing at the corridor's end in her formal coat, not the too large one, her own, like she'd come from somewhere or was going somewhere or had simply chosen to be dressed like herself for this particular moment. She looked at him. He looked at her. Mira between them was holding on and had no immediate plans to stop. "Your Majesty," he said, because some forms were worth maintaining even when everything else had gone a little sideways. "Engineer Ashtay," she said. Then with the slight wryness he'd heard exactly once before in a corridor at night with a candle, "Or perhaps Advisor Ashtay now if you've read the paperwork." "Advisor Ashtay feels premature," he said. "Nevertheless, that is what the paperwork says." Mira pulled back enough to look at him directly. "What's an independent royal technical advisor?" she asked. "Someone who gives technical advice," he said, "independently." She considered this with the focused attention she brought to everything. "Like what you've been doing." "Essentially. But now it's official. Apparently. And you stay." He looked at Saralyn, at the formal coat, at the expression that was controlled and careful, and also underneath that just a person who had decided to do the thing that was right rather than the thing that was convenient, which were not the same thing and had never been. "Yes," he said, "I stay." Mira looked satisfied in the specific way of someone who had done what was necessary. Learned the tertiary bypass sequence, fixed the residential lights kept hold in a corridor, and had arrived at the correct result through correct application of effort. "Good," she said. And then because she was Mira and she was 7 years old and she had her toolkit and her notebook and questions she'd been saving. "Can we do the secondary junction in the North Passage today? I've been thinking about the relay configuration, and I think there's something wrong with the—" "After breakfast," he said. "I'm not hungry." "After breakfast," Saralyn said from the end of the corridor. Not loud, just certain the way things said with complete conviction didn't need to be loud. Mira looked at her mother, looked at Corvin, ran a rapid calculation. "Fine," she said. "After breakfast." She walked off toward the residential wing with her toolkit and her notebook already open, already thinking about the North Passage. The corridor settled into quiet. Corvin stood. Saralyn walked toward him. Not quickly, not performing the walk. Just walking the way a person walked when they were going somewhere they'd decided to go. She stopped at the appropriate distance, all the right distances maintained. "The council," he said. "Oswald." "Davin presented the full documentation to the advisory council before dawn," she said. "Duke Oswald is no longer a council member as of approximately 1 hour ago." The documentation was sufficient. The documentation was comprehensive. She looked at him directly. "You built a thorough case." 30 years of practice," he said. "You learn what needs to be written down. And what doesn't? And what doesn't?" They stood in the corridor in the morning quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty. "I'm not a diplomat," he said. "I'm not a courtier. I don't know the Valkyrie protocol for most of what happens in this palace, and the portion I've learned I've had to piece together from briefing documents that were significantly out of date. I know, she said. The work I do is in walls, access panels, conduit lines. It's not visible, it's not glamorous. I know that too. So what exactly, he said? And there was something underneath the professional question, something careful that was asking something real. Does an independent royal technical advisor actually do here? She was quiet for a moment. He keeps things working, she said. The things in the walls that nobody sees until they stop working. The things that matter because everything else depends on them. A pause. And occasionally, he said, he has dinner with us on Wednesdays because my daughter has questions that cannot be adequately addressed in 30 minutes in a junction. Another pause. And because I have not had a conversation with someone who tells me the truth without performing the telling since Edrin died, and I find I'm not willing to let that go for the sake of protocol. The corridor was very quiet. He thought about what it had cost her to say that plainly, what it meant coming from someone who said everything carefully, and this had been anything but careful. It had been just honest, just true, the kind of honesty that happened when you were tired enough of the alternative. Wednesday's work, he said. She looked at him. That's your answer. That's my answer. The slight wryness again, the specific kind that meant she was still capable of finding the world absurd and appreciated encountering someone else who was too. All right, she said. Wednesdays. She walked past him toward her morning's appointments. Even, measured. Every step exactly what she intended it to be. At the corridor junction, she paused, without turning. The North Passage secondary junction does have a problem with the relay configuration. I noticed it last week. You might want to look at it before she does. He stared at the back of her head. You noticed a relay configuration problem. Edrin taught me the fundamentals, she said, still not turning. I was a competent student, and then she was gone around the corner back to being a queen with a full morning ahead of her. He stood in the corridor, let that sit for a moment, laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that happened when the world turned out to be larger than you'd thought it was, in a direction you hadn't anticipated, and that was not a problem, but the opposite of one. Then he picked up his bag and his toolkit, and went to find the North Passage secondary junction before a 7-year-old with 3 relay components and a notebook full of correctly marked notation got there first. 3 weeks later, the palace was running on full primary power in every wing for the first time since before the conflict. Every conduit completed. Every fault documented and repaired and signed off. The East Wing, where it had started, where a child had appeared beside a workstation with a worn leather notebook, and a question about what he was fixing was bright and warm and working exactly the way its designer had intended it to work. Corvin filed the final completion report. Official project log, every section, every repair, every maintenance recommendation for whoever came after. Then he opened his personal field notebook to a new section. Not damage patterns, not fault documentation. Different notes now. The way the morning light came through the East Wing windows at a specific angle and made the stone look like something that had always been meant to be there. The way Mira had started teaching herself the North Passage sequence unprompted, not because he'd suggested it, but because she'd decided it was next. The way Davin occasionally brought chess problems to their corridor conversations, presenting them as idle curiosity, losing to Corvin consistently, and affecting surprise each time, with an absolute straight face that suggested he was enjoying this considerably. The way Caroline at their third Wednesday dinner had asked about his wife, not performing sympathy, not filling silence with the socially required gesture, just asked directly the way she asked things she'd decided mattered. And he'd answered, directly the only way he knew how. And she'd told him about Edrin, not the official account, not the historical record, the actual person. The engineer who had become a king and had never stopped thinking like an engineer, which had driven the court officials to distraction, which Edrin had apparently found genuinely entertaining every single time. They'd sat at the table long past when Mira had fallen asleep over her notebook, her pencil still loosely held a diagram half-finished on the open page. Neither of them had mentioned what was appropriate. He wrote that in the notebook, Not because it required documentation, because he was a man who wrote things down, because writing things down was how they persisted, because the right things put in the right place outlasted the moment they were written in and became part of what stayed. He closed the notebook. Outside the window, the East Wing gardens were lit by the palace lights, primary power warm and full, the way they'd always been meant to be lit. Inside, somewhere down the corridor, the sound of small determined feet, and then the sound of a junction access panel being opened by someone who had been told after breakfast and had interpreted that to mean one breakfast, and now it was later. He picked up his toolkit, went to help. Down the corridor, in every wing of the palace, the lights were on. All of them. Full power. The way they were meant to be.